I'm Bobby Bowling. I think by our bylaws that we amended at the annual meeting a couple days ago, I actually am the TAP president already. So we have a panel to talk about. It's going to be a loosely structured panel. We have the executive director of TDHCA, Mr. Tim Irvine, with us here today. And we have, Marnie, are you director of multifamily?
Multifamily finance, yeah.
Director of Multifamily Finance, Marnie Holloway. So we're pleased to have them here. Like I said, I'm going to just give some general topics. Please feel free. I've done this before with Tim, and he's very easy to jump in with questions and interrupt, and he's pretty laid back on this kind of format. So we don't have scripts up here. I'm going to introduce some topics. Really feel free to raise your hand and ask some questions. This is a good opportunity to have the directors of our program here before us. I ask that if you have like a specific deal and you have a beef, maybe you not take that up here in front of the whole room. But other than that, general topics. So to start out with, I just wanted to let each of the two directors that we have here have the floor, speak in general terms of things you see coming down the pipeline. If you want to start, Tim.
Okay. Well, thanks. Can everyone hear me? Cool. Okay. Well, first of all, J. Paul Oxer, our board chair, sends his best regards and regrets that he couldn't make it, but something developed this morning that required him to stay in Houston. But he will be here for the board meeting tomorrow, and I got to give props to J. Paul and my entire board. This is one of the hardest working boards you will ever encounter. I know that it's never fun to be in front of them, but these folks really put phenomenal amounts of time and attention and concern into reading everything, understanding everything, and drawing out the full and balanced story and before they make their decisions. So I'm really honored to have such great leadership. As for me and my gang and what's going on here, first of all, as somebody said this morning, we're all in it together. And I said, you know, that could describe a cage match or sumo match. But no, we really are all in it together. I see a lot of old friends, I see a lot of new friends, and I see a lot of people who will soon be new friends in the room. And this really is a collegial process. There is no way that the rules we develop are going to please everyone, but I hope that they will, at the end of the day, at least be rules that everyone can understand and respect. And hopefully, as we continue to buff off the rough spots, there will be rules that are clear, and you know, whether you like them or not, they're at least understandable. So as we go through this continuing process of refining our QAP and rules for the coming year, I really hope that, you know, once these things go up on our discussion forum, you'll be as specific as possible. Feel free, if you've got a better way to say something, to, you know, send us draft language. As for what we are going to try to accomplish, I think it's best understood if first I give you a little bit of an update on the two things that I think are just world-influencing forces for us. Well, one is the ICP litigation, and the other is affirmatively furthering fair housing. In the ICP litigation, I think the Supreme Court gave some guidance to the effect that, yeah, disparate impact is a very real potential cause of action, but it requires that you point out a specific policy or practice that is causing that disparate impact. And if you identify something that's getting to a disparate impact result, stop it. That's why you got to know exactly what policy or practice is causing the problem, so that if it needs to be curtailed or modified, you know exactly what to curtail or modify. At the moment, this court, the trial court, has the case back, and they're going through the process of determining if the plaintiffs have made a prima facie case of disparate impact. We've had arguments on that, and we would anticipate a ruling issuing sometime soon. And of course, depending on what the ruling is, that'll determine where the lawsuit goes next. But I really think that the important thing is, from my perspective, and I think it's a shared perspective with my team and my board leadership, This isn't a won or lost situation. This is additional clarification and guidance as to how you engage in an appropriate approach to fair housing. I also think it's important to understand that the affirmatively furthering fair housing rules are really kind of a significant shift in our world. First of all, with the prior world, we weren't functioning under federally promulgated regulations. We were functioning under policy guidance. And I do draw a big distinction between promulgated regulations and policy guidance. Under the old one, we had to go through the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, where we went around the state, and we engaged people, had discussions, got input, looked at a lot of data, tried to draw conclusions from that data, and used the entirety of that process to identify specific obstacles to fair housing, impediments. And then in the process of planning, because this links up closely with the 5-year common plan approach, we were supposed to devise ways to address those impediments and measure our progress in achieving that. That's the world we're under right now. Under the new AFH approach, under the new regulations, in another year or so, we will be gearing up for, again, a broad-based dialogue with people all across Texas about all of these issues, but we'll be doing it looking at a lot of HUD-created and HUD-compiled data. I think that the message behind those regulations is less than clear in my mind. I think that you've got a couple of polarities. One is, do you want to eliminate historic patterns of segregation, or do you want to focus on expanding individual choice? Do you want to address the issue of putting more deals in areas of higher opportunity, or do you want to work with local governments to address concerted plans of revitalization? I think that there are a lot of polarities in the world of fair housing, and I don't think that the AFH guidance is crystal clear on articulating that. So I think that where that puts the agency, and frankly where it puts the state of Texas, goes back to SCOTUS's opinion in the ICP case. It's more important than ever to have well thought out, well developed, policy-based, articulated approaches that underlie the way that you put your program together. You need to say, yeah, it's our policy to do this, and here's how we're going after it, and then pursue it. I think that bringing it back to the QAP and the multifamily rules have been through just radical changes since the ICP remedial order. I think that the concept of the remedial order was certainly a well-intentioned focus on high opportunity to the preference over revitalization, but acknowledging that revitalization was still important. And I sense that we have moved beyond that place into a little bit more of a rebalancing. But I also look at the results of what's happened, and we've heard people talk about the donut effect, where you're doing revitalization in very much inner city locations, and then you're pursuing opportunity on suburban and exurban type deals. And what you've got is a donut in major Texas cities, and that's just not a helpful thing, because frankly that's where the vast majority of Texans increasingly are living, and many, many, many of them need access to great affordable housing. So we need to find ways to promote developing more housing in major urban centers, and not really go exclusively to those suburban sites, as desirable as they might be. I think that we've really fleshed out our threshold criteria a lot, and with the requirements that relate to disclosure and specialized handling of troubling situations with regard to underperforming schools or high crime or significant blight or whatever undesirable characteristics you might want to talk about, we should all be pretty confident that any deal that meets our threshold criteria, including meeting it through mitigation or a revitalization plan, is a good place to have affordable housing. So as a result, I feel much more comfortable taking some changes in the development of scoring criteria in a way that will open up some more tracks. I also think that, I'm an English major. What was your background in school?
Started out in biology.
Biology. Yeah, English and biology. We are perfectly prepared to do the urban planning and social engineering that this demands. We spend not hours, but days, weeks, months discussing what really constitutes opportunity. Bless you. And I don't think it's just living next door to somebody that makes more money than you do, or not living next door to somebody who makes less money than you do. I don't think it's just extremely high-performing schools. I know for an absolute fact that Texas teachers go through some very rigorous requirements to get their teaching certifications, and it's certainly possible to get an excellent education at a school where, as a community, it might be underperforming, but there are still very highly qualified teachers there, and there are great curriculum resources and other things. From my own personal world, opportunity is about living in a community of high expectations, where your adults in the household are promoting achievement by their kids. The kids are expecting success from the adults. Neighbors are expecting success from each other. It's largely attitudinal. So if you start mapping the characteristics of where that seems to be occurring, sure, you end up in high-income, low-poverty tracts a lot. But you also end up in areas of high growth, which of necessity means high job creation. Areas don't grow if they aren't creating jobs. You end up in proximity to things like institutions of higher education. For the elderly, I would imagine opportunity might be ready access to hospitals and medical facilities. For a person in a situation requiring supportive housing, I would imagine opportunity is proximity to supportive services. There are a lot of different attributes that constitute opportunity, and what we're trying to create, and we're going to have it out for your input and improvement soon, is going to be, instead of the opportunity index, it's going to be the opportunity menu. And if you're in a top 2 quartiles census tract, or if you're in a 3rd quartile census tract that's immediately adjacent to a top 2 quartile census tract, then you're eligible to start picking scoring items from the list on the menu. And that would also give us, frankly, a good second tiebreaker that even if you couldn't claim points on the opportunity index or opportunity menu, your proximity to the things that are on the menu could be an important tiebreaker qualification. We're also developing a concept that specifically addresses the issue of the developing donut hole in urban centers, and that is simply a point item for being proximate to city center as defined by City Hall in a large metropolitan area. Obviously, in a smaller community, that's not necessarily going to be the same kind of issue, but frankly, in Houston, I think it's a big issue. In Austin, it's a big issue. We need to make sure that we continue in connection with responsible civic growth in urban planning to support developing more tax credit housing in urban centers. Obviously, there are a lot of people who are engaged on this. Some are going to like it, some are going to hate it, some are going to raise legitimate questions, but we're going to put it out there for the discussion and see where it goes. Got anything you want to add there, Marty?
The other thing that we're doing with the opportunity menu is trying to address questions about gentrifying areas that have come up quite a bit in our monthly meetings, so that we're adding another potential point on concerted revitalization. So if you have if you can get 4 points under opportunity index, then you get a point under concerted revitalization. So there's actually potential 7 points on opportunity and revitalization. So it starts to equalize those. I'm trying to think of what else we have.
The only other thing that I would add is we are very mindful of the fact that urban and rural are different worlds.
Yeah.
And I think we really want to work on refining in tandem with some of the folks who are really engaged on rural issues, some incentives that will help them to do two things. One, to continue to develop new housing, but frankly, to find some ways to allocate resources that will help aging properties that are in meaningful need of rehab.
We're also looking at poverty as urban and rural poverty levels, and moving a little bit away from the just flat, statewide poverty caps. And that's something that we've been talking about quite a bit. The other thing that we're looking at is rather than using the statewide median on education, using that 77, going to the median for the educational service centers. There are 20 of them across the state, to start to regionalize that education measure. So we don't have carve-outs and that kind of thing. So that's another thing that we're considering. These are all thoughts, ideas that have percolated up through our monthly meetings before the board meetings. We've been doing a meeting on Wednesday afternoon, and I've come to call it group therapy.
For us too.
For us too. It's one of the few opportunities we have to really engage with you as a community and talk through some of these things. And a lot of these ideas have percolated up through those meetings. And I think they've been really useful. And we plan to continue them even once we're into the draft rule being published. We still have things like the application process and that cycle and all of those things that I think if we can continue to work together to move forward with those things, life will hopefully get better for all of us.
A couple of observations or some feedback from some of the TAP members that I've gotten. Now, as you know, and probably everybody knows, I operate exclusively in El Paso County, and so some of these things are not specific to me. It's kind of a medium city with a lot of dispersion, still a lot of vacant land in high quartile areas and some of the lower poverty areas, but that's not the case throughout the entire state. And what we have gotten from our members in the last 2 years since we've gone to the High Opportunity Index is a lot of the first and second quartile, specifically the first quartile, but I think it holds true for the second as well, combined with the 15% poverty rate. A lot of those areas, there's two problems. In the larger cities, a lot of those areas are already built out, or there's very few tracts of land. And so our members are chasing like 3 tracts of land that work in a large city. And so that's jacking then the seller knows that. The seller's got 5 offers all of a sudden, 5 inquiries about his parcel of land. So the price of that land skyrockets. It needs more resources from TDHCA. With a 30% boost, it sometimes still works, sometimes not. But even when it does work, that's not a good utilization of your credits. You're putting a 30% boost on some deal just because the land is $10 a square foot or something. And then secondly, the smaller towns with like 3 census tracts. Some of them they don't have for the MSA that they're in. None of the census tracts. I know I do have that instance in some of the smaller communities that are urban around El Paso. They have no top 2 quartile census tracts, and the poverty rate is too high. So there's just really no way to bring affordable housing to these 2 instances. So if you could talk a little bit about, I know you're aware of that, and I know that's where you're going with the menu, but maybe talk a little bit more to that. I know that's a pressing concern for a lot of people in the room, even with the 2 quartiles and dealing with the poverty level. Sometimes maybe even a medium poverty level doesn't work for those larger cities too, because again, whatever that median is, let's say it's 18%, still all those areas are built out, like in Austin or Houston or Dallas. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think that we operate under some constraints. We have limited authority to create below-the-line items. and we certainly are extremely mindful of the fair housing concerns. You know, the clear solution that could address so many of these issues is a solution that's not available to us, and that's to reassess and restructure the whole world of set-asides. I mean, if you're really going to a true dispersion through all kinds of income strata and geographic dimensions, that's how you get there.
Well, and I think that adding that third quartile threshold on opportunity, we're hoping will help. We haven't gone through and done all of the research, but the concept there is that in a third quartile census tract that's next to a first or second, unless there's a river or a highway or something in between, opportunity doesn't stop at that line. So so basically borrowing some opportunity from the higher income census tracts, and we're hoping that will first open up more census tracts, but also assist in some of those rural communities. And again, we haven't really run all of those numbers yet, but we're hoping that measure will soften that concern. And then also going to the menu rather than the way we were set up before, that linked income and poverty in schools. Now we're spreading them out a little bit.
Yeah, that's important. I know that, and maybe you could expand on that a little bit, talk about decoupling the income and poverty level from the schools. From what I understand, the direction you're leaning towards is making the school and the education points stand alone and not be...
Yes, we are, and we're also looking at other options within educational excellence, things like high school graduation rates, all-day pre-K, potentially the availability of charter schools and those kinds of things, but we haven't been able to really land on the best way to do that. That's a question that we're still looking at.
Are there some other questions? I don't want to be the only one directing questions on this area. Oh, sorry. Diana first. Yeah, go ahead.
And I will say, one, I really commend the direction you're going. I have been probably one of the most vocal opponents of high opportunity being just a census tract of income and poverty. And what I hear you saying is a very, very good approach to recognizing that high opportunity isn't just about the money in the tract and the poverty. It's about a broad range of things. And I really like the direction I hear you going. So, good work.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Tom Bruce has made it very clear and a good point that it's very difficult to establish areas of high opportunity if you don't have data that's available for the entire state that's renewed annually. However, and also with the environment that we have as far as getting away from the resolutions of support from the city, there's some pushback from the cities because they're kind of like, we'd like to know where we're going to put our property, where we would like and know where the affordable housing should be. So have you considered the idea of potentially allowing the cities to determine the areas of high opportunity if they get them approved by HUD that they meet all fair housing requirements?
If you didn't hear it, the idea was having the local governments determine the areas of high opportunity subject to approval by HUD. I think it's a wonderful concept, but logistically we are operating under such a ridiculously tight time frame right now. It would be very difficult to make that sort of thing happen for this round. But it's, and also, frankly, HUD's not exactly always willing to say exactly what it thinks.
Right.
I agree with you, but didn't the GAO come out and say that these resolutions is basically discriminatory and they're preventing fair housing? And so it seems like if they were going to, at least you'd have the opportunity. In the current administration, at least till the election, we don't know what's going to happen after that. But we've got a Secretary of HUD that's certainly open and realizes the problem in San Antonio at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and the GAO report, I think, points out nationally the same, issues and concerns that we've been hearing from all of you about the local support and about representatives and those kinds of, but for us, you know, we don't have another option at this point because those items are required by statute. So, you know, and unless there's a change there, we're really stuck with that structure.
Okay. Yes, Joy.
Tim, I would like to see the department take a look at those cities that are choice districts and think of a way to work with that. In the city of Houston, it really does not matter to what school you were zoned. It is very easy to go somewhere else. It's a one-page form. It's simple. If you live within 2 miles of your school, you aren't bused anyway.
Yep.
So every child, it's not the way it was when I was growing up, and the school bus pretty much came to my front door. We live in a major metropolitan area, and I think if you drew a distance, you know, if there are good schools within 5 miles or 3 miles or whatever we could work out together, but just to say you have to be zoned to that school doesn't, to me, make sense.
Well, I share your view, but I would just like to articulate that the whole concept of the primary attendance zone was that it was a simple way of saying, yeah, that kid has an absolute right to go there, and to the extent that it's been determined that it's the zone for that location, getting there should be pretty easy, and if it involves any significant distance, there should be no cost to transportation. And to me, if you look at a choice situation where somebody has the ability to make a choice, the choice that they're making does not have the ability to reject them, and they can afford to get there, to me, you got the criteria for success. So I think conceptually that makes some sense.
And you can see on websites of schools
Sure.
the capacity that school has.
Right. And we're developing some concepts along those lines already. So.
Other questions? Okay. You all have been holding roundtables, and we were talking prior to this, Tim, that you had the idea of continuing that. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how, give us some feedback without being in a roundtable, how the roundtables are going and what kind of feedback you're getting from those.
They are group therapy. Everybody sits in a big circle, and you know, there have been a number of meetings that we've walked out with some really good ideas and having had some really good discussion. There have been a couple that we've gotten really stuck on opportunity index and educational excellence. But all in all, I think that they've been really useful for all of us to be able to sit in a room and listen to each other and talk with each other about these things. I started out with a far more ambitious plan than what we wound up executing. Wanted to do some work regionally, you know, go out to folks who can't get to Austin and have those conversations out there, but just, you know, time and schedule wise that didn't happen. But hopefully this next round, Shay and I will feel a little more comfortable and able to get out and talk to folks. There's also work still to be done in the roundtables, as I said earlier, about the application cycle, about Chapter 10. You know, we've talked all about the QAP. We haven't talked about Chapter 10. So there's still quite a bit to do, and I'm finding that this is a really useful tool for us to present ideas, concepts to the community. We've talked about utility allowances, we've talked about 811, and it's a way to gather that feedback really quickly.
What about, we talked about you were thinking about starting to roll out some ideas on the forum with some actual language for us. Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm hoping to next week start to get up on a forum on our website, not necessarily the draft QAP, but chunks of language. This opportunity menu that we've been talking about, the changes in education, so that we can gather that much more input before we get to drafting.
Yeah, the scoring items in general.
The scoring items in general, yeah.
Okay. Is there any questions on any of that? Okay.
I'd just like to insert something. You know, roundtables are great, but sometimes you can get more done in a smaller meeting. It's very difficult as a state entity, though, to say, well, I'd like to have a meeting with you and you and you, because everybody else in the room thinks, I was left out of that. But on the other hand, if you and you and you say, we'd like to meet with you, I'm the government. I'm going to meet with you. I really think that when there are small, workable groups of you that self-organize and say, we'd like to sit down and talk about something with you, that's a great vehicle for us to just sit around the table and frankly make a lot of productive dialogue translate into something concrete. I'd like to give some shout outs to some people in the room that have done that. Certainly Janine and her QAP committee, you know, you and Scott and Walter and Charlie Duncan have been awesome. Can't tell you how much we appreciate the input. You know, Mark, Dennis, Dan, and Ginger, wherever they are, you know, your input, phenomenally valuable. You know, see Tracy around here, you know, Tracy always carrying her flag. I really do value that opportunity when somebody says, you know, I'd really like to spend a couple hours sitting around a table with you, drinking that good Free State room temperature water, talking about, you know, the future of Texas.
Well, the other wonderful thing, and Tim sort of touched on it, that I think has come out of the roundtables is that some of these groups have self-organized. There was a group that spent some time working on at-risk items that we still need to spend some time on internally, but we also saw developers meeting with advocates, meeting with attorneys, trying to work things through. And you know, to my mind, if those folks can come up with something that they all agree on, my work's done. Right? You know.
Yeah, and I want to also thank you for being so available. We've taken advantage of that invite as well at TAP. I know a lot of us, as representatives of TAP, have called for those types of meetings, especially with Tim and his executive committee, and they've been very receptive, and it's a very productive discussion. So I want to encourage everybody in the room to take advantage of that invite, and if you can't personally do it, just forward your concerns on to TAP. And I think, you know, that's what we're doing here as an organized group. We're the largest organized group, and we've got probably 90% of the people in this industry here at this conference this week. So if you don't feel comfortable or for whatever reason logistically it doesn't work for you, avail yourself of our resources and let Frank Jackson know what your issue is, and we're having somewhat regular meetings with Tim and staff as well to express concerns on behalf of the entire industry. If you've been here at all this week, you've learned politically that our big agenda item for the legislature is to try to remove the political point items from our QAP that are legislatively mandated to be in the QAP. The state rep letters that almost got removed a few years ago when the state senators removed themselves, the city and county resolutions of support or opposition, as well as the neighborhood opposition letter of support, neighborhood organization letter of support or opposition. We've had some discussion, and we understand logistically those are very difficult sheep to herd sometimes, and if you've watched any board meetings, you see that a lot of the debates are about some of those sometimes, and politicians, believe it or not, sometimes wanting to change their mind or have some different stories that come forward. Do you want to touch a little bit about that? Maybe talk about staff resources dedicated to that, or what percentage of your time evaluating applications do you think you spend maybe on these kind of chasing down political support and verifying and that?
Well, I think that what time we do spend is spent with outlier issues, situations where somebody has gone on record and wants to rethink or recalibrate or refine, whatever. We are looking at some revisions to our QAP language to accommodate that to a degree. We're obviously very afraid of the concept that someone who could know the competitive landscape and then make a single decision that changes that competitive landscape. So I think that the integrity of once you've given it, you can't change it, is an important and valuable protection. I think it really kind of comes back to education. I think that, you all have made some phenomenal headway in educating local governments and neighborhood organizations and members about the great things that you're doing. Right before this session, I had somebody pull me aside and talk about a success story in a small town that had been resistant, but now we're supporting 2 deals. So, hearts and minds can be changed in the local arena, not always, but often. And I think it's also educationally very important that members know exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what the implications of that are. We are always available as a resource if any member has a question about this process, to explain it, to walk them through it. Whether you want to be the one that has them bring us in, or whether they want to approach us on their own, that's fine. But we're all about education. I mean, it's an interesting, just a comment. 2 sessions in a row, I have heard people who are probably in this room comment after a particular hearing, my gosh, those folks were really well informed in your oversight committees. I can tell you, we work our backside off on that. Michael Lytle and his team, Bo, Marnie, me, Tom, we spent a lot of time going over there just to talk them through issues and tell them what's going on. Education is the lifeblood of this program after money. So.
Can you please tell them that this is the only program where their letter matters to the extent that it does? We were talking yesterday on one of the panels, if TxDOT's going to do a highway improvement, a letter from a state rep, well, it might matter, but it actually can't kill the project, right, like they can do with our housing development.
Right.
Do you want to add anything to that, Marnie, as far as the political? Let me ask you a more general question. So you've only been on this job for
less than a year.
How do you like it?
There's a loaded question. And I almost daily look at Tom and say, what have you gotten me into? I can tell you that it's been exhausting, but it's also been very rewarding. I have been so lucky to walk into a group of very talented, dedicated staff. Teresa, Andrew, Shay, all of the specialists. I'm just daily amazed at their professionalism and the quality of work that they produce. I have more than once said, okay, I'll go do that because I'm the least necessary person in this group, and that's really the truth.
What were some of were your expectations different than what the job entailed, or what candidly, anecdotally, can you share with us about?
Well, and I'd been watching for years. I was the director of the Neighborhood Stabilization Program before I came upstairs, and if any of you were involved in NSP in the beginning, you'll know that there were some bumps in that program. So I knew that it was very intense. I think I didn't realize the level of intensity, especially like this last 6 weeks or so, what that was going to look like. But I also, while I knew that there was support from executive, from the team, from the group, I think I didn't realize how accessible they are to me and how much they're willing to just step up and help me out. And that's really important.
Does anybody else have any questions? Oh, Diana.
Actually, it's sort of a technical question that's just been running through my mind. In 2017, QAP will be the first one that you need to implement that highest rank CRP deal.
Yes.
just Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and maybe
Yeah.
San Antonio gets that limit as well. So I think it's sort of cut and dry as far as the scoring.
For some, yeah.
But if that is an at-risk deal, how will the at-risk set-aside pull into the other if one of the at-risk deals is part of that CRP? Or am I just complicating things?
I personally think that it makes more sense to treat it under the sub-regional set-aside. But the question is, as we implement Representative Collier's bill on doing the highest scoring revitalization deal in major markets, basically, if that deal happens to be an at-risk deal, what would it do? I haven't got the answer. I'm just saying from a common sense perspective, it really seems to me like what that bill was talking about was basically divvying up the sub-region set aside.
I think the language in the bill says in the sub-region or in the region, and that's something that I can go ahead and put up on the form with everything else. We're basically adding it as a second restriction under the restriction on elderly. In the big urban regions, it's just going right in under that.
Okay, kind of my last thing that I had on my notes to talk about. Are you getting, or I know you get some feedback from the legislators. Is there anything you can share with us on a direction that they like that you're going or want you to go a different direction? I know there's 150 House members and 31 senators. Hopefully you don't have 181 different opinions, but if you could share maybe a little bit, Tim, of that perspective. I know you get calls.
I think that anytime any member gets calls from a constituent that's got a problem with a state agency, they jump in and they advocate for their constituent and try to make sure that the issue is properly addressed. But I got to say, I've got tremendous respect for our legislators and their willingness to say, okay, you addressed it fairly, consistently with your laws and regulations. I'm done. I have been, frankly, very impressed by the fact that really almost to a person, I have found that legislators do not approach their issues with us on a particular partisan basis. They look at things very objectively and on a law and rule-based approach. It's pretty darn neat. So, no, don't have such issues.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, go. In the back, and then you, Deborah.
My question is, as you grapple with all these various considerate issues, whether it's the scoring and the menu or legislative input on your process, things like that, what outreach do you guys do to other state agencies to see how other state agencies grapple with some of these same issues? And we're for a nonprofit that has developed a group nationally, and I have to say, Texas is a little different than a lot of other states in how you guys manage your process. Which it's hard for us as developers because each state's got their especially unique circumstances, shall we say. But I'm just curious what kind of interstate collaboration you guys do.
Quite honestly, I would say there's very little interstate collaboration for a couple of reasons. First of all, we do spend a good bit of time looking at what other states are doing, looking at their QAPs and their rules. And I have not seen ideas that yet I want to say, gee, I really like the way they're doing that. I want to bring that in. But, we do have an unusual statutory structure that lays out a lot more details on our QAP than other states. So what's going on in, Oregon or Minnesota or Pennsylvania is not necessarily going to be relevant to us. More importantly, frankly, I would say 99.9% of our ideas come from this room, and we think that you're the best and the brightest,
Well, I would add that there's an issue of size, of scale. There's NCSHA has an annual conference that I attended this past January, and I was sitting at a table with several other states, and we're talking about QAP development, and And one of the smaller states said, well, we did a listening tour and we went all over the state and met with all of our developers individually. So the sheer scale of Texas means that we could be picking and choosing from parts of other states, but there are very few that are going to be close to the magnitude of what we're dealing with.
I totally agree. I'll share an anecdote of my own. I'm real active at the National Association of Home Builders Housing Credit Group, and I would encourage everybody. J.P. Delmore was here at the early morning session. It's a fantastic group. It's very Texas, very well represented with Texas people at these meetings. But this was a long time ago. I started in this industry in 1999, and one of those first years, when I first was going to the Housing Credit Group, there was a guy in our group, and it was much smaller then than it is now. And I remember he's from South Dakota, and he was talking about, because we were talking about, well, the board members of these state agencies and blah, 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 or the staff, blah, blah. And then this guy speaks up and he goes, well, we in South Dakota on our board, we this and we this. And he kept saying we. And he was a developer. And finally we were like, are you saying that you are on your state housing agency's board? Yes. And you're a developer that's applying to that board? Yes. But I recuse myself when it's my own team. So yeah, I imagine there's some pretty funny little hunky-dory state arrangements around the country. So if there's no other questions, yeah, Deborah, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to make one comment when you were talking about education and fair housing. We heard a lot about that this conference, and I know we're going to be successful in getting rid of the support, resolutions or the lack of support in the case of some of these neighborhood veterans. But I believe we have to continue to educate those local governments, because there is still zoning, and we have to continue to educate school districts in terms of the responsibility we have to educate children. And I really appreciated TML being here this year. I think that was important. I understand you all will be attending a session. More of those opportunities to be part of panels, to create panels about housing, how this whole idea of cross education, how housing has to do with schools, and housing has to do with even urban planning through AIA. More of those opportunities where you all are involved, where we're involved together to educate. We just have to take advantage of those. So I completely agree, because fair housing is something that they all have to realize.
Right, yeah, Tim and I are scheduled to be on a panel at the TML. I know Deborah knows that. That's the Texas Municipal League. And I learned yesterday on my panel that there's something like 1,200 municipalities around the state. Something like 1,000 of them are less than 10,000 people. And something like only 50 of them are not represented by the TML. So it is an opportunity. I know even in a city as large as El Paso, when I'm talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing, they literally have no idea what I'm talking about. The concept, the legal, and even for us practitioners, it's something, I mean, I have to admit it took me a couple of months to digest in my brain as to what that really was saying and what that really meant. So, yeah, Deborah's right on point. Please go back home and educate your elected officials about these issues and concerns. Any other questions? Okay, one final question. How long will the board meeting be tomorrow? An hour? 30 minutes?
TBD.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming here. We very much appreciate you coming to our conference every year and participating. Very much,
We
Tim.
appreciate you continuing to ask us.
All right, I think the conference is pretty much wrapping it up. Christy, anything to add?